So secular people say Christians are obsessed with sexuality and they talk about it way too much. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's interesting how a culture that's obsessed with normalizing sexual deviancy wants to call people who are trying to resist the normalization of deviancy the ones who are obsessed. I do think that sex shows up on page 1 of the Bible, male and female. And so part of the reason Christians care about sex is because that's part of the creation story, that God makes people sexed, that God doesn't make humans, he makes males and females. We think about humans as like an interchangeable meat Lego thing. And obviously humanity is a valid category, but you don't see God creating humanity in Genesis 1 and 2. You see him creating male and female. So there's something to God's design that's inherently sexed, it's inherently sexual, and it's inherently reproductive and procreative, which means that if you care about Genesis 1 and 2, you have to care about sex. I also think that sex is a big ingredient in human flourishing, that some of people's darkest, most areas of shame because of what's been done to them or because of what they've done is sexuality. And if we don't touch the thing that is the most intimate thing about us, we end up missing people in the highest of the highs of their life and the lowest of the lows of their life. And so I think good shepherding requires speaking to sexual issues, both on the victimization end, like sexual abuse is a big deal, on the shame end, the regret end, and also on the positive vision side. That God could have made humans reproduce like cells, mitosis, meiosis, could have made humans reproduce like some of those seahorses that reproduce asexually, but he chose to reproduce through the act of love, the sex act. And he designed it on purpose and with purpose. And so if we believe in the goodness of creation and the goodness of the creator, then sexuality has to be not necessarily front and center, because the gospel is always front and center, but it has to be towards the front of the bus that we're driving on speaking to people in their real life issues.
Hey, welcome to the Preaching Through podcast. My name's Dave, and you are not Luke Simmons. You are Seth Troutt.
I sure am.
Yeah.
I am Seth Troutt.
Hey, we've talked about you a few times.
Oh, you have?
Oh, yeah. All good things. All good things.
Yeah, lessons from mistakes of our friend Seth.
No, Luke has spoken fondly of you, and we've mentioned you back and forth. So you and I actually have a little bit of a history beyond. So you are the teaching pastor at our church here.
I am, yeah.
Ironwood Church. But our history goes back before that. We were both at Grace Community Church in Tempe.
Yeah, back in our teenage years.
Yeah.
We were worshiping together. You were the worship leader, and I would every now and then, as a high schooler, sneak into the college group to hear you lead worship and participate in the back of the room. So there you go.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
All right. Good to have you. And I think, did I show up at church the first Sunday? You got hired like in 2016, and then the first Sunday you were speaking was the first Sunday that we attended. I think, is that?
It was very close to that.
It was very close to
Yeah,
it.
I don't know if I didn't know that was your very first Sunday, but I remember we joined the church like within a month of each other ish. So,
yeah.
so
I had no
close.
idea that you were there, and I show up and I was like, I remembered Luke, but I was like, Matthew's on stage singing, and my friend Mike is playing bass, and Seth is teaching. It's like all these people that I know. Well, it's good to have you on the podcast, man.
Well,
I'm glad that you're
here. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Real quick, this is the podcast where we have the conversation on what it is to preach Jesus in 21st century. We said America for a long time, but the stats say that it's just all across the earth. So to everybody who's listening in every country, we're so glad you're here. And we just want to be one voice of encouragement, helping you honestly, be faithful and fruitful in your preaching, show up big each and every week, wrestle through difficult questions, and provide one voice of encouragement to help you continue to preach well and just get better over time. And today we're talking about preaching through the topic of gender and sexuality. And real quick, I think it would be important just to share, like, why would we have you on this particular topic versus maybe Luke speaking? Like, what is it about this topic that matters to the church? What is this about this topic that matters to you?
Well, I've kind of accidentally become someone who speaks about this stuff a lot. So I get asked to be a guest preacher at other churches, men's events, women's events, things like that, Sunday mornings. And I think a lot of that has to do with my doctoral dissertation that I started in 2020, right during the COVID lockdown. So my dissertation was called Digitization and Neo-Docetism, which is about the nerdiest thing I ever aspired to write. I'd like to, my dad's a PE teacher, and I would like to write and speak like a PE teacher's kid, not like an academic nerd. But it was all about the effect of digital technology on how we relate to our bodies. Is my body me, or is it the container of me? Am I my soul or my thoughts, something that I can upload or put online? Or am I my whole self? Is my body me or not? And so my dissertation really, I ended up reading a lot of queer theory, like the Judith Butlers
Mhm.
of the world, and reading a lot of digital futurist uh, thinkers, sociologists who are looking at where the world is heading and how people relate. And a lot of it was how my conclusion ended up being that part of what explains the rapid rise in some of the transgender stuff, especially among young people, is how much their screen use separates their mind from their body.
Mm.
You know that so Docetism is a first century heresy that taught that Jesus didn't really have a body; he just had the appearance of a body, which is the Greek word dikeo. So Docetism, it's a heresy saying Jesus wasn't really a body; he was a spirit that appeared to have a body. And so Neo-Docetism is like a similar idea that, especially among young people, the belief that I am my body is me, and my body soul unity is actually my source of identity. Neo-Docetism is saying like, no, my body's not me. My real me is my thoughts, and we can separate those. And so that's why, for the first time, I think in world history, for a long time, if the mind and the body were out of sync, you'd say we need to adjust the mind to match the body. But more recently, that is called conversion therapy.
Mhm.
And doing the opposite thing is called affirmative care. That if my mind and body are out of sync, I need to adjust my body to match my mind. So, how is that possible? Well, I think it's the Docetism thing. The real me is my thoughts, my body is just the container of me. And when you think about the future of like eternal life, there's all these like thoughts and speculations about we're going to upload our consciousness to a microchip and it's going to go into the cloud. And we're going to live in, you know, 10110 land forever. So like this belief that our self will continue in perpetuity because of technology. My body, it'll be gone. There's this show on Netflix called Altered Carbon, which I don't recommend because it's wildly graphic. But it's this whole idea that your body is just your skin, and you can take the chip out of you and stick it in another chip. So we
And
could
all the wealthy people are the ones that are able to afford
the
doing
hyper
that.
rich
Yeah, the
people,
hyper rich
And
people.
so I can take my chip out and I can put it in Dave and be Dave for a day. I can also take my chip out and put it in a woman
Mhm.
because I identify as a woman this week and live as a woman. And so that kind of our bodies are swappable. The microchip, the consciousness, the soul, that's the real me. So because I wrote on about that, especially the transgender stuff in Gen Z, that's right next to all the issues of sexuality and gender, masculinity, femininity. So I had to read a bunch of like super nerd stuff to get that out. And I'm still trying to distill or detox all of that out of my system and write and speak in such a way that's helpful to actual people, not just other people with doctorates who think I made a good argument. So I've ended up talking about this stuff a lot and helping other churches talk about it. Uh, Getting hired to write on this stuff for other people, and it's become a passion point of mine because I tend to be frustrated. One of the ways I discern calling is follow my anger. So what makes me angry? Well, it makes me angry how poorly Christians talk about gender and sexuality. Well,
Yeah.
maybe that's one of the things the Spirit's using to call me into the next season. So I think that's why you asked me to be on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. And real quick, did you ever see the Amazon Prime Video, The Upload, which is
Yep.
a more playful
Exactly
version
like
of it?
that.
Like,
Yeah.
I enjoy watching that, but I'm like, this is not
Yeah.
reality.
I mentioned that in my dissertation as well, the upload and the altered carbon one. And
Yeah.
it's just so many people think that's like actually tenable by like 2070, that type of thing.
Mhm.
And I think from a Christian perspective, I just don't think it's plausible or possible. And even if it was, it wouldn't be desirable.
Mhm. This matters for the church in my perspective for all the reasons that you said, but to boil it down, in my perspective, the church teaching on gender and sexuality in the face of the LGBTQ movement, in the face of the transgender movement, it almost feels like it's defensive, and it's why we're not doing that. You have, as I've sat under your teaching and I've read some of your work, you have really been thinking hard about this and developing more of a, I don't know if you would characterize it as offensive, but like that's their argument. But here's the Bible's argument. Why is it important for the church to articulate this strongly from a biblical perspective as opposed to fighting against the cultural perspective?
I think there's two reasons. One is discipleship, the other one is evangelism. So, from a discipleship perspective, people need to know how to relate to the bodies that God gave them. Should I feel good about my genitals or bad about my genitals? Should I enjoy sex and marriage? Is it okay to experience and live with the pursuit of pleasure? If so, how do I understand that? Is sex only procreative? Like, is it a duty so that you can have kids, or is it something meant to be enjoyed? So people want to be discipled in their whole life. That's part of the reason why people show up to church. I mean, there's obviously a whole host of other reasons people show up to church, but I think a lot of people actually want to know, what does the Bible have to say about every area of my life? And there is a ton of data on sexuality in the Bible. And not going there because we're squeamish or because of our own sexual anxiety or because we were carrying wounds from some kind of weird version of purity culture that makes us too slow to speak. It's actually not being faithful shepherds or disciplers of our people. So discipleship is a big part of it. I think evangelism is also a huge part of it. In my own family life and in some of my friends I've led to Christ in the past few years, part of what's made them begin to search for God and search for truth has been the absolute wackiness of the trans movement and or their own, I got what I wanted sexually and now I'm depressed and anxious and there's an overpromise underdeliver thing that happened. The world told me that sexual conquest will lead to fulfillment. I succeeded in the worldly endeavor and now I'm empty, isolated, and sad and addicted to porn. I don't know what to do. Uh, Vice versa, I've a buddy who we just baptized a few weeks ago, whose like daughter is like 14, had a friend come out as trans, and he's a non-Christian guy, and he goes, "What the heck do I do about this?" Because he'd had this kind of like, "Hey, if it doesn't hurt you, no
Hmm.
problem, no harm, no foul."
Yeah.
But now he sees like the damage of one of his daughter's friends, and he's looking for moral clarity somewhere. Shows up at church looking for moral clarity. And if we were doing don't ask, don't tell at church, he would have not found what he needed.
Yeah.
I do think that the brokenness of our culture sexually is leading people to look for a better vision for sexuality. And so there's another family that we baptized on Easter who they came to church their first time at church. I ended up happening to be speaking on gender. And if you go like, is that what you want someone's first time at church to be? If you're inviting a buddy to church, you're going, are they going to talk about sex or money? Okay, maybe come a different week. But they come, the teenage son, is going to a public school and it's super confusing and there's no rules. But the only rules are like, don't ask, don't tell. On if someone comes out as trans, you just say,
Yeah.
you just affirm, affirm, affirm. And how do I do it? And I taught my big idea was your body tells you the truth of who you are. And if you want to know your gender, you should look in your pants and not in your heart. And that resonated with a high school boy. He said this was actually helpful in my day-to-day life. And so I'm not saying stuff so that non-Christians get the feel goods from it. But I'm telling people what the Bible says about our bodies and basic human anthropology. Like, oh, this is the moral clarity I was looking for. And so that's an ex-Mormon family that we baptized at our church as well. And so I think the days where we were doing like seeker sensitive, avoid the hard issues,
Mhm.
it doesn't work in an internet culture where people are exposed to a thousand various messaging things a day on all the hardest of the hard topics. I think pastors have to courageously and non-anxiously speak with truth to a dark culture. And if we can do that in a way where we see ourselves as also needing grace and in need of help by the Spirit. So it's not
Mhm.
a smug, judgmental, self-righteous thing, but it's a hey, the world is confusing and I've found answers in the scriptures and let me share them with you. This is going to help us. This will help you be a dad. This will help you be a husband. This will help you be a mother and be a wife, because the Bible is full of good news. Obviously, there's the good news. Jesus rose from the dead, but actually the Bible's teaching on sexuality is good news too. And so speaking in directly with clarity and compassion, being clear at the expense of being cute sometimes. Sometimes we can be too cute and it ends up being not clear. I think it really serves people from an evangelistic perspective, not just a discipleship perspective.
That's how I approach parenting with my boys. And I realize that if I don't give them a baseline foundation of what to believe or what to think or how to approach a certain subject, they're going to get that baseline foundation established somewhere else. And then I'm fighting against whatever their friends wind up telling them the truth is. I'm fighting against whatever they learned in a non-Christ affirming classroom. And so I'm not afraid of having those conversations, but I realize if I get to them first with sound, biblical, Jesus-backed, content, then it's going to be easier for them to not make sense on their own, but at least have a category for this. And then now the forces that be are fighting against what we've established. I think a little bit of the difference here is that people are coming in with having these baselines established elsewhere, and we're helping to establish a new baseline. One of the challenges that I see, I don't preach, but from the perspective of pop culture, it seems like this goes back and forth from, well, when the church talks about it, it's a political issue. But when LGBTQ talks about it, it's not a political issue. This is human rights issue. So is it a political issue or is it a human rights issue, or what issue is it?
Well, if it's a political issue, then we lost for sure.
Okay.
So maybe at one point in time, there was things on the ballot.
Mhm.
Is marriage between a man and woman, or is marriage between two consenting adults? Soon we'll see marriages between any number of consenting adults. And so if it's a political issue, then we lost and we should stop talking about it because the ship has sailed. At least, even previously the GOP had in their party platform, marriage between one man and one woman. That's gone now. The end, we lose, right? So I do think there are moments where it becomes political when you're trying to seek the public good on behalf of a society and you go, should it be allowed for men to have multiple wives or not? Well, that's a political issue. What are the policies that support human flourishing? And so to some extent, we do have a belief about certain policies that would support human flourishing. And so we want to be part of legislating those. That's why we have speed limits. We think it's good for kids that people can only drive 15 around them, right? I also think it's good for kids that they have one man and one woman married to each other, loving each other. If you think about what's good for the children, well, the data says that the biblical teaching on marriage is good for the children. And so that being said, we don't have anything near the votes to pull that off basically anywhere in the United States. So I would be slow to say it's not political because it has been, and there are degrees in which it's political. But that's not the driving force here. It is thoroughly theological, biblical, first and foremost. Before there was even such a thing as a government, God was establishing marriage in Genesis 1 and 2. Far before the United States was even a thing, the church held marriage in esteem and in high honor. And so it can't be purely political because what is being contended in the political sphere changes from generation to generation. It has to remain a biblical issue. And I do think that as pastors and Christians see opportunities to, like Jeremiah 29:7 says this, seek the welfare of the city to which you've been sent, because in its shalom and its blessing and its welfare, you will also find welfare. And so there are ways that Christians can engage that. That's not just partisan scream yelling. So it's the saying it's just a political issue when you're talking about gender, I think totally misses the idea, because the Bible predates any modern political categorization.
3 times every Sunday, I walk up those steps to open the Bible and preach the good news of Jesus Christ. You do that too. And in those moments that you're walking up, it's an unsettling feeling, right? Some of you goes like, I'm not worthy of doing this. And listen, none of us are. But here's what I want for you. I want you to be able to walk up those steps and feel confident, to feel ready, to feel prepared, to feel like you are a workman who has done the work, and you don't need to be ashamed as you handle the word of truth. And so that's why I've created the Preaching Lab, to help you prepare, to help you have tools so that you can walk up into that pulpit, not in your own strength, but with the confidence that you are ready. So click the link below and see if the Preaching Lab is the best next step for you to feel more confident, so that when you take those steps, you can take a deep breath and have a blast.
We set up with a lot of, hey, why does this matter? Why is this important? But let's get down more to some of the actual core values that the Bible tells us about. What does the Bible actually have to say about gender and sexuality outside of the purity culture that I've been fighting against from the 1990s? And
The purity culture hurt a lot of people, and so minimizing its effect downstream is kind of foolish, right? Ended up kind of being like a sexual prosperity culture.
Mhm.
Like, I know people probably know about financial prosperity gospel, but like a sexual prosperity gospel, if you do the right things, then you'll be happy and God will love you more or something like that. And
Mhm.
so a lot of people who like save themselves for marriage, then got into marriage and realized their husbands were abusive or selfish or ridiculous, or didn't know enough about women's anatomy to please them sexually. And
Yeah.
it's just disappointing. And so you get overpromised, underdelivered on the God's plan for you to have better sex is, uh, and it ended up, I have a lot of my sisters and my wife and my sister-in-law had that pretty negative experience. Like one of my sisters was told not to wear her seatbelt in the car because it would accentuate her breasts and cause men to stumble. So you want to talk about having a poor relationship with your body, being told your basic anatomical structure is a liability is not a great way to help people receive their bodies as a gift from the Lord.
And that was the part that I had the biggest hard time with is I was like, this, I didn't have the language for it, but I was like, if I did, I would have been like, this feels very, very legalistic and this is not good news.
Yeah. And this idea that like modesty exists as like the last line of defense against men's disgusting intuitions, as though people in like Muslim countries where women are covered in burqas don't also commit lust. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? So there's some folly in there, and depending on your church context, you probably have to preach against some of the negative aspects of that purity culture because people need to be seen in their suffering, and I think that's part of it. But when people say, "What does the Bible teach about this?" So I tend to go to Matthew 19 first. And here's why, is because people tend to be interested in what Jesus says. And so if we want to follow Jesus, we want to follow how Jesus does gender and sexuality. So in Matthew 19, the Pharisees or the Sadducees come to Jesus and are like, try to trap him on an issue of divorce, which is really, in their view, an issue of sexuality. And can you divorce your wife wherever you want? Meaning, if your wife's not getting it done, can you just dump her and move on? And so they test him. They're trying to test him on this question of marriage and sex. And what Jesus says, have you not read? And then he quotes Genesis 1 and 2. So what I say is we want to follow Jesus, and then we follow Jesus to Genesis 1 and 2 as our starting point. That for Jesus, Genesis 1 and 2 is not just a story of what happened back then, but it's actually a normative moral authority in the way we live our lives now. Before we understand anything on sexuality, on divorce, on marriage, we have to go back to the foundation of the universe, Genesis 1 and 2. And so what you get in Genesis 1 and 2 is a pretty radical idea here. And there's really a couple movements that I think help us make sense of this. So number one, men and women are created together to do what's called the cultural mandate. So it says, male and female, I created them, and God blessed them and said to them, subdue and have dominion, be fruitful and multiply, are like the big. So subdue and dominion is like production, it's culture making, it's kneading of bread, it's stomping of grapes, it's take the undeveloped and develop it. That's subdue and dominion. Fruit for multiply is not production, it's reproduction, right? It's have sex, have kids, and do that. And men and women together are the image of God, and together they're given these shared tasks. And so one of the things you get on page 1 of the Bible is you could call it gender equality, that they together are equally made in God's image. And we modern people go, obviously, because we've been conditioned by the last 150 years, even by the last 2,000 years of church history,
Hmm.
to believe men and women are the same worth and the same value. And that feels like assumed. But the first hearers of that would have been wildly surprised. Wait, women are made in God's image too? I thought men were the image of God, or I thought priests were the image of God. But all men, all women, they all are images of God. That's wild. And so the first thing you get, Genesis 1, has to do with the equality of the sexes, the equality of male and female. But then at the same time, you see differentiation, you see distinction. And uh, so before we get to that, there's this warning you get from the scriptures to don't overestimate the difference between men and women, because you'll end up getting some type of hyper patriarchy or misogyny, which is women hatred, or misandry, which is man hatred. Women hatred was kind of, now it mostly lives online, but in the past it was kind of this, like Plato taught that women have lower IQs
Mhm.
and they're not really as valuable. And that's so like women are like incomplete. Men was the Platonic view that women are just humans who fail to grow a penis and so they're stuck being women, was the low view that the Greeks had of women.
Which is real great news, right?
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of like the modern gender theorists say that like, well, in Western history, women were defined by their lack of something, not by being a woman, but by
Yeah.
being not a man. And so but now in modern times, like the man hating is more prevalent probably. Well, if women are running the world, it'd all just be better, and men are the problem, and testosterone is toxic, and toxic masculinity. This,
How much of the hatred is a reaction to what has been, and how much of the hatred do you feel is a reaction to what is?
I think people are trying to explain what is, and you have to go to what has been.
Got it.
And the world is unjust, and there's so many wars, and the rich get richer, and the men have been mostly in charge. Therefore, men
Yeah.
are inherently the issue. So that's not all unfounded criticism.
Yeah.
But when you go to Genesis 1, male and female, both in God's image, you realize that there's no room for misandry or misogyny uh, if you want to have a Christian
Yeah.
framework. Then at the same time, the next temptation is to overestimate their sameness. And you get this interchangeability thing that you kind of get what Mary Harrington calls the genderless meat Lego. You can just swap it out in what anything a man can do, a woman can do, anything a woman can do, a man can do. And people are sometimes tempted to believe that until they have children or get pregnant, and you realize, oh, there are some things women literally can do that when men cannot. Men cannot gestate a child within themselves. Men cannot breastfeed. Males cannot do that. Females cannot implant the seed into a uterus. Like there's so many things there that get obvious. And so within the Bible, you also get the differentiation in Genesis chapter 2, where Adam is by himself in the garden. This is kind of pre-Eve's creation, and he's called to serve and protect or work and keep. And that's language that some police departments take, right? Serve and protect. That there's a vigilance, an awareness that Adam is given the commandment from the Lord, do not eat of the tree by himself. Adam is called to watch and keep watch over the garden by himself. And then Eve is created. And so Adam has this like priestly role. And that vigilance, that serve and protect, that work and keep, has everything to do. Like if someone has low testosterone and gets a testosterone shot, they'll find themselves more vigilant. Strength will go up, aggression will go up.
Mhm.
And so I do think that the man, biologically speaking, is inherently more predisposed to serve and keep. That service is an act of physical strength most of the time. That's why men tend to work in outside of the home in farming culture. Men throw the bales of hay and women grind the grain. It's like their physical predisposition that women tend to be closer to children because of their biological structure. And when you're closer to children, you can be at home grinding the grain, whereas the men are out in the field plowing the fields, doing the thing. So their physical predispositions serve a dual function.
One of the things I've heard you say regards to that is it's these overarching, it's like it's a curve. And so there might be some instances where a woman's physical disposition is, you know, How did you, do you know what I'm talking about? It's like generally true. It's true, but there are some exceptions, something like that.
Yeah, I think height is a good example of this.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so I appreciate this. I don't want to speak in absolutes or universals. Only the Seth deal in absolutes. But if you think about height, like it's absolutely true to say men are taller than women. It's false to say all men are taller than all women. On physical strength, 98% of men are stronger than 99% of women. So if you think about two bell curves that overlap, right, depending on the topic, like virtually every WNBA player is taller than me, but I'm still physically stronger than I think every WNBA player. You know what I mean? So if you talk about just raw physical strength, it's 99. So like if you think about just testing grip strength, 98% of men are stronger than 99% of women. So what I mean when we talk about some of these things is they're generally true, but they're not universally true. And so it's more like in the realm of Proverbs. Like Proverbs will say like lazy people get poor and people who work hard are rich. It's like, well, we could all think of exceptions to that. That doesn't make the proverb false. It makes it a proverb. So it's generally true, not universally true. And I think for a lot of stuff on gender, it's important that we have that, right? So little boys tend to want to wrestle. Some little boys are artistic and want to read. That should not make us go, maybe they're trans. That should make us go, there's diversity within God's creation. I also think I don't want to pretend like the generalities aren't true, right? So men are taller than women. Not all men are taller than all women. Some women are taller than men. And that's just the nature. So it's biological observance. But what you get in 1 Peter 3:7 is Peter affirming that kind of creational difference. So Adam is in that priestly protective role, keeping the commandment, guarding the garden. And 1 Peter 3:7 says, showing honor. So husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. So what you get is the woman is the less physically strong body, weaker vessel. That's what it means. And what that means is that men are supposed to leverage their additional strength as a way of showing honor. And so the additional strength comes with additional responsibility. And I think the language I like to use for that is chivalry. It's walking street side, it's holding the door open. I think about the image of like a male cheerleader who uses his strength to lift up versus like the punching down thing that happens. So again, most of world history, men were to use their strength to make sure they were served. But Jesus comes and flips that and says, no, you use your strength to serve. And so chivalry, while being kind of a medieval knight thing, I think is a helpful way of talking about the additional responsibility men have by virtue of being stronger. And I think 1 Peter 3:7 is a really helpful text for that, but it's also, I think, connected to the Genesis 2 thing, that there are things men and women are called to do together, and there's something that the man was called to do that he super failed at really hard. That's one of the reasons why I think Jesus had to be a male, is because the male failed in the garden to protect the garden and keep the commandment and pass it on to Eve. But Jesus comes as the last Adam, the true and final Adam, who does, in fact, protect the garden, who does, in fact, keep the commandment, who does, in fact, succeed in the priestly role. And so gender, even then, I think becomes close to being a gospel issue, because now you're talking about, why was Jesus a male? Why did Jesus have to live a sinless life? Why did Jesus die a substitutionary death? Well, because he used his strength to show honor, because he was the undoing the fallenness of Adam. And so all of that, I think, is related to the Bible's teaching on gender. That being said, you overestimate their difference. And it's like Proverbs 31, the Proverbs 31 woman. She's described as having strong arms and a strong back, who buys and sells land to provide for her household. That would code as radically progressive in our current gender wars discussion. So the Bible has a category for women as provider, women as strong, having a strong back. Likewise, you have David in the Bible, who's poetic and emotional and kind of cries a bunch of time, which people would call like effeminate.
Yeah.
Not even feminine, effeminate, which is more the insult thing. And so depending on where you're sitting, the Bible can look progressive or it can look radically traditional, conservative. And so the Bible actually presents a pretty balanced take. And so we don't want to overestimate the difference on gender, and we also don't want to overestimate the sameness. And we want to hold on to the fact that males are males by virtue of their biology. Their body tells them the truth about who they are, XY versus XX, that there are disorders in development, and those are hard, but those, I think, that discussion belongs in the category of theology of disability, not theology of gender. But the Bible is actually paints a pretty broad picture on the different types of men and women it holds up as heroic and meaningful and faithful.
You touched on it briefly, and I don't want to go too deep into it here. Maybe we could do a separate episode. But you talked about chivalry, you talked about masculinity. One of the things that very early on, as you were developing language that bridged uh, your doctorate dissertation to more like, guys like me, was the language around the masculinity pyramid. And I think it would be helpful to hear, like, just how are you categorizing, how are you defining masculinity? And what was that? What was that the reaction to?
Yeah. Well, thank you. So I have a book coming out on this, I think in 2026. At least that's the plan right now.
Woohoo!
Yeah. When this comes out, I may have closed negotiations with publishers, but that's the plan at this point. So this question about masculinity, I think, begins in the wrong place. First, you begin, how's masculinity different than femininity? And I think that's the wrong starting point. So I think the most important thing about a man is the fact that he's not God, that he's a creature. And that if you really think about how is man different than God, if you meditate on that, if you sit with that, the result is humility. And so masculinity is first opposed to divinity, that man is not infinite, he's finite. And when you really think about that, when that sits with you, you get this virtue of humility. Man's not God, he's humble. The next layer up is, well, he's a creature, but he's unlike the other creatures. The other creatures are ruled by animal instinct, Pavlov's dog, ring, bell, drool. But man has moral vision, has integrity, has purpose, has drive beyond reproductive instinct and survival. And so when you think about that, man has discipline. He's able to discipline his desires, to choose between them, to have the wanter in their heart healed, and have rightly ordered loves that supersede, that man might want to be promiscuous. But what he wants more is fidelity to his wife and a strong, healthy marriage. And so he says no to the lesser instinct to say yes to the great one. So man is disciplined because he's not like a dog. He's not an animal, not just an animal. The next layer up is man's not a boy. He's not a child. He's an adult. Adults are able to care about themselves. Adults don't need a mother telling them to brush their teeth and wake up on time. And so you think about the difference between like a boy and a man is it's a responsibility thing. A man can take care of himself. He's responsible for himself. He's also responsible for others. He can care beyond himself. So man's not God. He's not animal. He's not boy. So he's humble, disciplined, and responsible. Then the top of that, you get the man's not woman, which is where I think the virtue of chivalry comes out, because he's stronger. His body's different. His work tends to be different. Technology's changed some of that, but chivalry is the big piece. And so those four virtues. And what you get is, I think that pyramid does two things. One, it helps you see we don't want to overestimate the difference, that women are also called to be humble, responsible, disciplined. Yeah. And that's okay. That like 3 out of the 4 are things we have in common with women, not different than women. But the top of the pyramid is men and women are different. And here's how we articulate that as chivalry there. So that's masculinity pyramid.
You've given several sermons on this at the church, and then you've been writing articles articulating, we'll link to some of those, articulating what the Bible has to say about these things. What is some of the biggest pushback you have received from people disagreeing you? Like, what are the points that they're taking issue with, and why is it that those points are just incorrect?
Yeah, the hardest points of pushback, just for me as a man, as a person, is people's like personal stories. My Aunt Susie was Uncle Steve, and he was depressed and he was anxious and he hated himself. And then he realized that he was trans, and now he's Aunt Susie. And who are you to tell me that his body was telling the truth? I think his body was lying to him. I think his mind was telling the truth. And it's always, I think, like gender brokenness, sexual brokenness, the personal stories are the most heated emotional points of pushback. I was raised in purity culture, was told sex is for marriage. This teaching harmed me. Now I'm promiscuous. my husband and I have an open marriage. We sleep around. I'm fulfilled. This is good for me. Who are you to say what I'm doing is wrong? And so it's people who have internalized or hook, line, and sinker bought into the world's lies. And so the reason they're wrong is that our minds are clouded by sin. Like, we are professional self-justifiers. We're darkened. We despise the truth. Like, it's basic, like what Reformed thinkers called the noetic effects of sin. It's not just moral brokenness, but it's also like intellectual brokenness, that we lack self-awareness. Thinking about David and Nathan. David had kind of rationalized his whole thing. And then Nathan comes and says, hey, there's this man who like didn't have very much and they got a ton of stuff, stole his girl or stole his sheep. And what should happen? David's like, that man stinks. And Nathan goes, you're the man. Like, until Nathan held up the mirror to David, David couldn't see himself. And so it's always the hardest as a pastor, sitting with people who can't see themselves, who are like, I'm happy doing this life. And you don't look at them in the eyes and say, you're crazy. But you go like, your experience is your experience. At the same time, part of my role is try to help shine the light onto darkness. And so a very small percentage of people have left our church or been very angry with me over it. But it's mostly been people who, like, right now, the pleasures of sin are working. They're serving them. Like, think about in Hebrews chapter 12, it talks about Moses, who forsake the fleeting pleasures of sin, looking to the greater reward. That we'd be foolish to deny the fact that there are pleasures of sin, but they're fleeting pleasures, and they just haven't failed them yet. So that's like the hardest pushback, is the personal stories, the anecdotes, the argument from lived experience. And most of the time I don't know why Steve became Susie and now they're doing better. I don't know Steve's whole history. I don't know what the seed was planted in him that made him think his body was lying, but his mind is telling him the truth. Like, unpacking that would take months, probably years, to understand that. And you don't have the pastoral proximity, but now this person's stuck between, do I love my Uncle Steve and Susie, or do I love Jesus? And you're putting me in the position of having to choose. And I hate that. And that is a hard thing, because this person says, affirm me, or you're cut out of my life because you're toxic. And Christ is saying that's not how this works, right? Reality supersedes personal experience. And so that's the hardest part.
One of the things we've talked about on this podcast is the Sermon Insights meeting, and how going into that Wednesday meeting, hey, here's kind of what I think I'm going to be talking about, and what are some examples, and getting the people in that Sermon Insights meeting to help wrap some more life experience around it, right? And what they discover is, like, I have to take this message and I have to preach it to an 85-year-old widower, and I have to preach that same message to a 17-year-old testosterone-filled football player, and then, a married family with an infant and there's like, this is really, really hard. As you're preparing to preach on one of these particular topics, is there anything in particular that you try to keep at the forefront of your mind? Is there any disciplines that you have to keep those perspectives in mind? Because, I don't know, it'd be easy to just kind of like have your either dogmatic, this is what the Bible says, just pile drive through it, or over empathetic to your own particular situation, yet you've got to minister to all these people.
Yeah, I do find that, especially bringing stuff on gender and sexuality to the more mature women in our congregation and going, hey, here's what I'm thinking, here's where I'm going.
Like ahead of time.
Okay. That really does two things. One, if I was aware of my blind spots, they wouldn't be blind spots. They would just be spots. So I guess. So
put that on a X
there you go.
card.
Yeah, there you go. So they'd just be spots. And so saying, hey, what have I not considered? Who am I not thinking about here? And then trying to make sure, like you did this for me earlier. I'm talking pretty dogmatically, black and white, about men are this, women are that. And you're like, hey, hold on. You mentioned this thing about not universally true, generally true. I think that helped me go like, you're right. I'm speaking in the proverbial category, and I hadn't said that yet, and I need to say that. And so going like, hey, if you have the right caveats and the right softeners, you're going to help people feel seen and included in what's going on. So that's the one thing is what exceptions do I need to remind people of? What pain points do I need to have top of mind as I'm bringing this? So when I'm giving examples, you might be this, you might be that. I can do that. But the other thing too is talking to some of these more mature women in the congregation. Here's where my heart, here's where I'm going. What do you think? One of the things that does is when people in the church perhaps go and complain to them about what I said, I'm actually equipping them to be my defender.
Mm-hmm.
I know what he said. I know how you heard that, but we actually had an hour-long conversation about it. And here's what he was meaning to communicate. And here's actually, I think, what he was trying to get at. And you know what? I bet if you emailed him about it, he would hear what you have to say. And because that's not really his heart. That's not what he was trying to communicate. And so it's actually serving me twice.
Yeah.
I'm being served because my sermon's getting better, and I'm equipping the people in my congregation to help go to bat for me if I'm perceived as unapproachable or rigid, or if someone mishears what I'm saying, or they hear one sentence what I'm saying accurately, but miss the next 3 paragraphs because they were so triggered they couldn't listen anymore. So I think that's a dually beneficial practice.
We've talked about in a different episode, preaching through tough text. There's culturally tough, theologically tough, emotionally tough, and there's one more. There's one more box. But the more that a particular text intersects those, like it could be theologically tough, emotionally tough, culturally tough, like that makes it a more difficult text. So obviously, it's a tough text when you start preaching on gender and sexuality because it touches so many of those boxes. Are there any particular reasons that you see preachers maybe trying to avoid these or not putting it in the sermon calendar? What might those reasons be, and why would you not need to fear those reasons and just go for it?
Probably the best reason I've heard pastors avoid it is they say, I think talking about this stuff is the responsibility of parents, not of pastors. And I say, yes and amen. I think the primary responsibility on this stuff is parents. And so they don't want to talk past parents to kids, like middle schoolers, high schoolers. I think that's a good thing to want. At the same time, I think the pastor's responsibility is to equip parents and to speak to parents, to help them speak to their kids.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we've done is we have offered warnings. Hey, in 3 weeks, we are doing this sermon series. So if you want to beat us to the punch and talk to your kids about it, now's your chance. Or we've done parenting seminars where we're trying to train parents on how to talk about this stuff. Given content warnings ahead of time, where if someone has like a 5th, 6th, 7th grader that they're like, I don't know if they're ready to hear this, and they're too old to be checked in kids ministry, like, all right, take them out to breakfast and avoid if you want. Like, so people have the right to opt out.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like a captive audience, like you just told the whole church Santa Claus wasn't real, and I took my 2nd grader in here and you ruined my Christmas. You know, like you just told everybody that the stork doesn't bring the kid, you know, dad has to have sex with mom, and that's where I came from. And so you kind of give them the chance to opt out. And so I think you don't have to fear the superseding of parents if you just proactively think about how to frame your partnership with parents in this. The other thing, I think people avoid it because they don't want to like lose their soft converts. You know, people are committed to Jesus, but they're not committed with their groin yet to Jesus. And I do feel like there really are like 3 conversions that have to happen when you come to Christ. You know, the sex, money, and power. You know, the conversion of the groin, the conversion of the wallet, and the conversion of the workplace. That unless you're giving someone a chance to honor the Lord in those 3 areas, you're not really knowing if they've embraced the cost of discipleship yet.
Yeah.
And so trying to like soft pedal hard stings of Jesus, now you're a pastor who's incongruent with Jesus, who in John 6 said, eat my flesh, drink my blood. And like a bunch of the people turned away like, this is too much. This is a hard saying. We're out. You have to give people the chance to opt out. You don't want to bait and switch people forever. Again, if nobody's ever opting out of your ministry, you're probably not preaching the whole counsel of God. And so we have to understand here that you could prepare and pray and do your best, and people say, I don't want this, and they'll leave. And that does not mean you failed. Sometimes that means that you succeeded, and that's okay. Like with Jesus and the rich young ruler, the guy walked away sad, and Jesus let him go. Like, we have to do that. And I realize, depending on your church size, that's a differently painful situation. Uh, but people leaving sometimes means you did something right, not means you did something wrong. And another reason I think people sometimes opt out of this is just their own personal sense of inadequacy, their own shame. I'm sexually broken. I'm not super in touch with my masculinity. I don't think my household's in order like it should be on these issues. Therefore, I'll just be silent on them. And on the one hand, I admire that humility and that self-awareness, and I think that's a good position to be in. But I think you need to let that emotional reality color your preaching. Hey, I'm preaching to myself on this. Hey, I wish I internalized this message when I was 15, but I didn't. And that led to 17 years of destructive habits and behaviors. I taught this past couple months ago on the lie that sex is just physical, and talked about the spiritual, social, connected reality of sex and God's design, that sex would be the pinnacle of intimacy built upon emotional, relational, financial, legal intimacy. And a woman in her 70s came up to me in tears afterwards and said, I came of age in the free love Hugh Hefner era. And if someone had told me this 60 years ago, I would have been saved from 30 to 40 years of ridiculous, unnecessary pain. And so the belief that I'm not great at this, therefore I can't talk about it. I'm like, well, then I can't talk about anything. There's zero realms in my life where
Yeah.
I'm sinless, right? And I think our own shame, our own sexual anxiety is part of this. And if it's really going to cripple you, then you should probably just go to therapy right now and begin working through stuff, because I think part of your responsibility is to speak the whole counsel of God to your congregation. And if you have such an inhibition within you that you can't speak on this, then you need to work through that and make that a high priority.
One of the things we talk about in a preaching calendar, like one of the benefits that you don't think of, is the fact that you're able to start doing not just some of the work of study well ahead of time and gathering books and gathering resources to get well versed on a particular subject, but it gives you're always trying to practice what you're preaching. I think it was, where is it? Where he sets his, sets his heart on God's word, he practices, and then he teaches.
Ezra 7.
Yeah, Ezra 7. And that practice part, like a week, that's not a lot of time to practice. Like, obviously you want to, but if you set up a preaching calendar and you put this particular topic on your preaching calendar, and you know that you have work to do in your own life in this area, much less understanding how am I going to communicate this, like, that gives you a big runway to work through a lot of this on a personal standpoint, and then figure out even ways how to work that into the way that you present it. With that said, are there any resources that you would point preachers to and say, hey, if you are going to take this on and tackle this topic from the pulpit, here are some things? It might be some of your own work that you've done, or some of the things that you've read that have been particularly helpful, but I'd love to point preachers to resources that can aid them.
Yeah, I think that the sermons that Luke and I have done on this the last few years were actually pretty good. I say that in all humility. Like, I think that was
Yeah, they were. I mean, I'll say
a prayerful, collaborative
Yeah.
process that I think we each have touched sex and gender a few times in different contexts and different angles. I think that'd be great. One of the resources we've used here is the book Unwanted by Jay Stringer. We hosted an Unwanted conference here, which is all about unwanted sexual behaviors or desires. Where do those come from? How do you work through that? How do you interact with your sexual fantasies? Do you just ignore them? Do you process them? How do you go back and ask where they came from? That's a really great thing to work through. I think there's a podcast like the Adam Young Place We Find Ourselves podcast, which is helpful on some of these issues. It's not a sex podcast, but it's in that realm. The Being Known podcast with Kurt Thompson is really good. He works through his book, Soul of Desire, Soul of Shame, Anatomy of the Soul. They're really good, especially Soul of Desire when you're talking about sexuality is a big one. Kurt Thompson would probably be one of the more formative, like a psychiatrist, neuroscientist people in the Christian realm. His stuff's really good. So I think checking out some of that stuff too. There's 2 books I've read recently that are really helpful from an evangelistic perspective. One is Louise Perry's The Case Against the Sexual Reformation. She's not a Christian, but she's writing about the failed promises of the sexual revolution. She's a British woman. And if you just want from like a pure secular perspective why the Christian sexual ethic is probably good news, that book, I probably am tempted to quote it way too much. My last time I taught on sexuality, I initially had like 8 quotes from that book in it, and I painfully cut out 7.
Had to kill some darlings.
Killed 7 of them and just used 1 of them. But it's just really helpful just considering what's it been like to grow up in the sexual reformation without God, where the free love thing is everywhere. And so those are some resources that have helped me process and think through a lot of this stuff.
And then I want to point people to your account on Twitter /X. Is it just Seth Troutt, Troutt?
Seth_Troutt.
Seth_Troutt, Troutt.
There you go.
Right? Because I remember you said when we got new Ironwood emails, everybody is first name, last name, but everybody misspells Trout. So I just want Seth at.
Yeah, Seth at Ironwood.
Well, which I guess that's your email address we just gave out too. You might get an email or two. But then also you have several articles that you've published across the web for different online publications. You've been a part of several additional podcasts aside from this one, and that's at southtroutt.com.
You can follow those, try to keep it updated as we can.
Yeah, and we should probably get something on there for people to, and I say that because I set that up for you, but get someone to put in the email address so when this book comes out, they get a little notification that says, hey, you can finally read an entire 300 pages of Seth Troutt, or however many pages.
Give me like 180.
Okay, all right, there we go.
But so 2026, the masculinity book's going to hopefully come out. And then 2027, a book called Jesus Loves Your Body, I'm going to try to have come out. So I'm trying to negotiate the 2-book deal at the time. And the Jesus Loves Your Body book would be on sex, gender, sleep, diet, exercise, aging, disease, emotions, kind of just a broad, how to receive your body is like Jesus loves your body, so you should too, and here's how you do that. So that one's probably 2027.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Preaching Through podcast. And if you liked it, send us a message, info@faithfulandfruitful.com. Let us know what was most helpful. But more than that, if you have ideas or if you have requests on future episodes, we would love to hear those. We've done those in the past, taken what some folks have written in and turned those into episodes. And we'd love to be able to consider doing the same for you. Like I said, you can find Seth on Twitter /X at Seth_Troutt with 2 T's at the end. You can go to SethTroutt.com, find other articles written by Seth as well as other podcast appearances. And yeah, man, thanks so much for doing this. I'm really, really grateful. And I learned quite a bit kind of behind the scenes from some of these messages that I heard. So thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.